All right, so we've established the argument. Let's go ahead and look now at some objections to this argument. So Jung thinks the choices of the two couples are morally analogous, right? They both make voluntary lifestyle choices that result in environmental impact of E5. And so perhaps calling these, though, an argument could be that perhaps instead of calling these analogous, perhaps there are some morally relevant disanalogies. And so let's go through some of these disanalogies, ways that the analogies are different, the greens and the grays. Perhaps the ways that these are different provide us with enough ways of arguing to prove that the premise themselves are not true. So the first way that these two examples between the greens and the grays are different is that what the greens do is selfish, right? While what the grays do is not. The greens are just overindulging, over-consuming, while the grays are simply adding children to the world, right? Having kids. So is that a difference? Does selfishness here matter? Well, a rebuttal to this could be something along this line. First, it should be noted that many, maybe most people have children for selfish reasons, right? Either they are trying to continue one's family line, they want to have the fourth, a junior perhaps, maybe to experience unconditional love. They've heard great things about kids and the connection that you have. Maybe it's simply to have an adorable baby in the house, maybe to save a marriage, to live on forever through their children, etc., etc. Right? So people typically have children for selfish reasons. Similarly, one can overconsume for non-selfish reasons. Like, imagine that I own a bunch of jet skis, a hot tub, an indoor swimming pool, a yacht, and so on, that I can be the best host in the world and show all of my friends a good time. I'm not being selfish by buying these things for my own consumption. I am buying these so that other people can consume them. So is being selfish a fair criticism of the greens, and is that relevant to the grays? A second potential rebuttal could be, especially when harm to others is involved, acting selflessly does not automatically make something permissible. For instance, I might steal from the rich to give to the poor, or murder innocent people to distribute their organs to those who need them, but in each of these cases, I act for the sake of others and not myself. But this does not automatically entail that my action is permissible, right? So, does the selfish intentions, does it really matter here? I think Jung is saying it doesn't matter. Which brings us to our second possible argument. And that is that the grays are merely exercising a human right, namely the right to procreate. But there is no right to overconsume. And so if we're going to frame this as someone exercising their human rights versus someone who's just being overindulgent. So how would Jung reply to this? Well, first, Jung points out that even if there is such a right, and surely it is not absolute, right? For no right is an absolute right. We've talked about this in previous lectures. Right? For example, we as Americans, we recognize rights that include the freedom of speech and freedom of religion, as well as rights to life and liberty. But are these rights absolute? Meaning, can they never be restricted? And it seems that is not the case. For some restrictions of these rights is surely permissible. For instance, the right to free speech should be restricted, right? One does not have the right to shout fire in a crowded venue. In addition, words that incite illegal activities or actions, libel, slander, and certain obscenities. For example, saying the F word on primetime television are all currently prohibited by the federal government. Freedom of religion should be restricted, right? So, for instance, one does not have the right to make human sacrifices, even if one's religion demands it. The right to life is also restricted. For instance, killing in self-defense is permissible, as is the right to liberty. Right? For instance, you will have certain liberties taken away and be imprisoned if you commit a crime. So, yes, we have certain rights, but these rights can be restricted. In short, whatever supposed rights we have, none of them are absolute. They are overridden in special circumstances, namely circumstances in which exercising them would result in harm to others. And arguably, this may be true of today's world of overpopulation and overconsumption and climate change and depleted resources. So the right to procreate, if there is such a right, could be overridden, right? Especially if it might harm others. Second, even if there is a fundamental right to reproduce, there is probably also a fundamental right to property and liberty. That is, we typically think that we have a right to own things. Examples, we have a right to own our wages, our properties, our homes, our possessions. And furthermore, we are free to do whatever we want with them. For example, we own SUVs and we are allowed to joyride in our SUVs if we so choose. Now, let me take a moment in here and step out here into a side question. Right? Because Jung also asks, if humans have a fundamental right to reproduce, do animals also have this right? Or do they have rights to life? And if so, the more we populate the earth, the more it is the case that we encroach upon nature, and animals are being run out of their habitats and dwindling in numbers, right? We're seeing mass extinctions that are unprecedented. In short, if we reproduce more, animals die more and reproduce less. So does exercising our rights violate their rights? Now, I don't have an answer for you, but certainly something to think about. All right, third, another potential flaw in this argument is the idea of diminishing marginal utility. In this idea, each additional unit of resource consumed produces successfully less and less happiness. So the grays produce more total happiness in the world than the greens do. Okay, so Jung dismisses this objection, stating that it relies on utilitarianism, which he says is false. So go back to you utilitarians. Jung says utilitarianism is false. And also stating that even if it were true, we could just deny the diminishing marginal utility that it applies in this case by stipulating that the greens are made enormously happy by their excessive consumption, right? Just because the grays are bringing children into the world and are so happy for it, doesn't mean that the greens aren't also equally happy. But perhaps he could have added that overall, even if the grays produced more net happiness among their family alone, the grays contribute to overpopulation while the greens do not, thus perpetuating overcrowding and overpopulation and making the world a little worse off because of it, right? Especially if their kids also go on to have children of their own, and those children go on, and so on and so on. A fourth potential argument here is that each human life has intrinsic value. So the argument could be that the grays produce E5, but they also produce two valuable human lives. Meanwhile, the greens only produce E5 alone. So for instance, imagine that the eco-gluttonous green family achieves E5 merely by building two robots, which will go around for the next 75 years and consume resources. Isn't there something more valuable about producing two real, live human beings who will do this, as compared with two robots? If that seems right, then perhaps you believe that there is something inherently valuable about human life, something here that trumps just merely the consumption of that energy. Now, the rebuttal, first, many question whether human life has intrinsic value at all. Does it? Does human life have intrinsic value? Second, most Americans consume at least 2,000 animals over the course of their lives. But even if they are vegetarian, they contribute to the death of plant life, as well as environmental degradation and destruction, which results in more animals dying. For example, due to climate change or other pollutants or simple deforestation, and so on. So if animals, plants, and ecosystems have inherent value, then each human being is likely to take just as much value out of the world as he or she puts into it due to their inherent worth as a human. To think otherwise is to adopt an anthropocentric view of value, or what Singer called, in something that we studied in a previous week, speciesism. Though, as we have seen, there are reasons to doubt whether or not speciesism is true. So we'll pause here. These are some common arguments. Let's look finally at the conclusion.